Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Beyond Vulnerability Scanners, 10 Ways Attackers Exploit Healthcare Networks. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm the Senior Physical Threat Analyst with the Health ISAC, and I will be introducing today's speaker from BreakPoint Labs. Today, we will be hearing from Andrew McNicol. He's the Chief Technology Officer at BreakPoint Labs. Healthcare organizations face a growing threat landscape where traditional security measures often fall short. Vulnerability scanners, while useful, frequently miss critical risks that real-world attackers exploit to gain access to sensitive systems and data. Join BreakPoint Labs offensive security experts as we unveil 10 ways adversaries compromise large-scale healthcare environments, techniques that go undetected by standard security tools but are actively leveraged by attackers. Through real-world examples and expert insights, we will expose gaps in common security approaches, highlight weaknesses that pose the greatest risk to patient data and operations, and offer practical steps to mitigate these threats. By the end of this session, attendees will have a clear understanding of the attack methods actively being used against healthcare organizations today and actionable strategies to strengthen their defenses before a breach occurs. This session will be recorded and sent to attendees following the presentation. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A box throughout. Andrew will wait till the end of the presentation to respond. And with that, I'll pass it over to our speaker.
Thanks, Jeff. Hey, guys. Like Jeff mentioned, my name is Andrew McNicol. I am the CTO at BreakPoint Labs. And what I'm going to be doing today is sharing with you basically 10 ways that my team, as well as attackers and other pen test and red teams, take over healthcare networks. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and this is what works on almost every engagement. I would say that probably all 10 of these techniques I see almost every time. I'll kind of highlight that as we go through each one. And the goal here is to arm you with the knowledge you need to improve your security before a real threat actor exploits this in your environment, because these things are either not caught at all from vulnerability scanners, or they're not really highlighted the risk because it requires some things to kind of connect the dots. But at the end of this, you're going to walk away with several key things that you can do that will improve your security. So let's jump into it. Going to go over just quick who we are, talk about the problem, and we'll jump into the ways. So who are we? At BreakPoint Labs, we started about 10 years ago with the vision of really just breaking the cycle of what we consider sort of checking the box with security. We want to go, beyond, that box check and really find what attackers can do and help you identify that risk that's otherwise missed. One of the common things I see when I do engagements is, these vulnerabilities I'm pulling out of networks have been there for 10 years and missed for 10 years. And they're always, that question is why. That's kind of the mission for us, is to help you find that out. We also do defensive cyber services as well, traditional incident response, network security monitorings, and things of that nature. As I mentioned, BreakPoint Labs has been around for just shy of 10 years. What I do daily is I hack stuff for a wide variety of customers, do a lot of focus on healthcare. Prior to being a penetration tester and red teamer, I came from working with law enforcement and counterintelligence organizations, tracking down the bad guy. And that's what kind of led me to wanting to do what I do today, is I wanted to be proactive. I kind of got tired of constantly responding to those things. And I said, man, if we can get ahead of this, we could have prevented this. I kept seeing incident after incident, something you could prevent with, some small tweaks that people weren't doing. And that's what led me to where I am today, of being, kind of coming from that side of the fence and wanting to be more proactive. I also really just enjoy finding high impact vulnerabilities that are, not seen by vulnerability scanners. It's kind of my passion, is like, really diving deep into the data and finding some cool stuff. So I'll show you how I do that. So this is something that is a passionate thing, or near and dear to my heart, because as we do these engagements, I'm on the outbriefs for the engagements. It's always this common thing I see as an organization is like, well, how did you find this? Like, how did we not see this? We've been doing vulnerability scans and vulnerability management programs and other assessments for, 10 years. How did we not see this? Right? That's a common theme in the outbrief. And what I've deduced from that is both the assessment teams and the organization have an over-reliance upon the vulnerability scanner. I think people tend to, they give you a lot of data, right? And it's more data than you can really deal with as is. So you tend to do the vuln scan, and you got this mountain of data with a bunch of other tasks to do. You take care of the criticals the best you can, and you still have a bunch of Adobe you're chasing to update. Reality is, I don't really care about the Adobe. So I'm going to help point you guys in the direction of what really matters. It's going to help give you better context in some of those vuln scan results, and also give you some other data sources to add to your vulnerability management program. I don't want to say that I'm bashing vuln scanners. They're very good. I like them. They have their place, but it's just important, like any tool, to know what they're missing in terms of the visibility gaps. So I think you'll get to see some of those areas here as we jump into the 10 ways. So without further ado, here we go. The first way, a tale as old as time, it's been around forever and it's not going to go anywhere, is weak passwords and password reuse. I know you've heard it and you've seen it. I'm going to give you some context. What I find happens is that there's obviously been a big push to two-factor, and this gets discounted, right? Well, we got two-factor. Yes, you do. I should tell you, I've been on networks that are supposedly full two-factor, and I've been doing that for a long time as I worked with early adopters, and nobody is full two-factor. There's always accounts that aren't two-factor. So these passwords, weak passwords, still are relevant. And I should tell you, I probably get into 5 to 10% of accounts with weak passwords on pen tests and red teams based on, the organization's password hygiene. People have some, better than others, but it's usually 5 to 10%, and it's a significant amount. What you'll find is that a lot of the passwords that are, weak, and aren't two-factor or tend to be service accounts. A lot of those are set up to be in programs programmatically interact with LDAP and things of that nature. So you don't have somebody putting in a smart card. There's obviously solutions for that, but this is where I see a lot of password usage. And when you have password usage, it's the human behind the keyboard creating it. So you have that human element, which is always going to be risk, right? When I was an admin, I was doing it too back many moons ago, right? You have keyboard walks. It just becomes easy ways to meet the complexity requirements that technically are still guessable, right? So these keyboard walks, while, got the special characters, got the right length, I can tell you that's the first keyboard walk I will test on a network. And I had a hospital in November last year, got me domain admin. Boom, out the gates, that password right there. It always happens. And like I said, what I'll do is I will do what's called AD slow brute forcing, where I'll pull the users and I'll try one password attempt per hour across every user. And I do that because I'll augment that and change that speed based on the organization's password policy. So it won't always be that. That's the common speed based on default password policy. But I will build a high confidence list of 50 passwords, targeting season and year, company, organization, name and year. I'll look at if I can figure it out, what their default password is for account setup. Think your welcome 123, your change me variants, think of, those kind of things. And maybe even the local sports team for the geographical region, things like that. These are building that high confidence, 50 or so passwords, and you get into a significant number of accounts using those techniques. And again, this is one of the things that I just haven't been on a network where I haven't seen this be the case. So if you're wondering if it's in your environment, I would say there's a really good chance of that. So the solution here is to have some way to audit your passwords. If you have in-house security teams, getting a hash list for them to try to crack, they're going to have fun doing that. It's going to be an engaging thing that actually doesn't take a lot of man hours, because you're essentially putting it in a password cracker rig, and you can unearth this. You can also outsource that obviously to a third-party tester. You can look at, making heavy use of Microsoft group managed service accounts, as that's rotating the password for you. And there's also a lot of enterprise solutions out there, which is not the focus for this talk. I'm trying to cover, things that are free for you to do, but there are enterprise solutions out there that sort of do password blacklists and things like that with an Active Directory. Suffice to say, nothing's perfect, and you still want to audit. So, my suggestion is to have that regular password hygiene check done every so often in your organization as part of your ongoing vulnerability management program. The second thing, and right now, this is the hot one. When I go on a network, this is the first thing we check, usually, because it accounts for, I would say right now, about 90% of the time it works. It's based on recent research the last couple of years, and it deals with Active Directory certificate abuse. So there's a lot of new research that came out around this, not too recent past. And essentially what it involves is attackers identifying permission abuse paths that allow them to control certificate templates in Active Directory. And this allows them to basically request a certificate as anyone. We probably request it as maybe a domain admin or somebody with a high level of privilege, depending if you don't want to get caught using a domain admin. There's a lot of things to this. You can basically I've seen instances where in Active Directory, you have a group called the Everyone group, which, as you might be, as the name implies, everyone's in it. So effectively, it's everyone. They have the ability to modify the certificate templates. Well, that's really bad, because you can configure them to be vulnerable. You can configure them two things: that anyone can enroll, which means anyone can request a cert, right? And then you have the other object, which enrollee supplies subject. Now, what that means sounds confusing, but what it means is I, as the person requesting the certificate, can supply the name of who I want the cert to be for. So I can say, hey, give me a cert for the domain admin. Thank you, please. And you can run off with domain admin privileges from anyone in the network. I see that all the time. I should say 90% of the time, this gets us domain admin out the gates. How do you evaluate this? There's 2 free tools to check out. They take about maybe a minute to run, maybe less. Verify and Certify. These will run on a domain connected system or with credentials from Linux, but you can run it right from Windows. You probably will have to have an exception folder for your EDR, and they will print out their vulnerable certificate templates for you to look at, and they give you the necessary information on how to secure them. So it usually involves modifying the permissions to that template or changing the template around. But this is a big deal. And if you do this on your network right now, if you're seeing this and have no idea about this, either run it yourself or have one of your security engineers run this, and you can identify critical risk out the gates probably today. Kerber roasting, another technique. This is one of the ones that's been around a while. It's nothing new, but it's also not going anywhere because it is a Microsoft-ism. It's just how it works. So it's good to be aware of this so you can properly set it up in your environment. It's something that you're going to need in Active Directory more than likely. Most networks have several different accounts that have what are called service principal names, set up SPN records as part of the user, and that allows that account to effectively work like a service account in Active Directory. But what it allows you to do as an attacker is request a ticket granting ticket from AD, and then you can extract a password representation from that. It's not the same as like a standard NTLM hash. It's a little harder to crack, but it's still crackable, especially if you have some of those weak passwords we showed above, right? Those keyboard walks and things like that. It's going to make it real easy. So what you want to do in this situation, I find, is most people don't have a good understanding of what accounts are actually even Kerber roastable environment. Right off the bat, they have too many. So that's the first thing to do, is just limit what you have there, because you probably have more than you need over the years of using AD. And then limit the permission to those accounts, because a lot of times those accounts are set up with just wild permissions, like oftentimes domain admin. Oftentimes they have access to all the servers when they only need to do something on this one server over here. They give them access to every server in the environment, right? So that's an example of like way too much permission. So the second I crack that, again, all the servers when I could have just maybe gotten into one. So really like tighten down those permissions the best you can. Ensure on those accounts you're using those really strong passwords or the Microsoft Root Managed Service passwords, even better. That's going to make it really difficult. And then also ensure that Kerberos is not supporting some of the weaker encryption algorithms like RC4. So setting that up properly can really limit your risk there. But I find that most customers don't even understand which accounts are Kerberostable. So how do you find this? There's a lot of ways to do it. My way is I just run a tool called Sharphound, import the data to Bloodhound, and you can see which are Kerberostable there. And essentially, you just have to figure out which accounts have SPN records set. There's a lot of different ways to do that. That's a free way that I do it using Bloodhound. The next item here is the sensitive information on shares. So I have never been on a network to date where I have not found critical risk on the shares. It is absolutely a treasure trove. It's one of my favorite things to do is dig through shares. And you have to think about it. Ask yourself the question, do you know what data a standard user has on your environment on the shares? Probably, it's been my experience, most people have no idea. They think they do, but have you tested it? I will spend on an engagement, we usually have an engineer spend a full day or multiple days looking at the shares to dig out information, because it's usually just that full of wins, that full of PHI, passwords. On a most recent engagement, I got, and this happens a lot actually, a spreadsheet with the login credentials and URLs and IPs for all the infrastructure, VMware, switches, all the cameras, you name it, all in there. And it was a password protected spreadsheet, but the password was in a file in the same directory. So, it's stuff like that, right? We're going back to the human element of it all. Shares become wild places to be, tons of data, tons of PHI, tons of risk. And most places don't have a good way to manage that. So what I do, and what I recommend customers do if they haven't done this yet, is to audit those shares. There's a free tool called Snaffler. You can download that. It does require you compile it, and then you can run it. And it uses it has its own built-in regular expression. You can modify that before you compile it. But that will basically pull out, even in default settings, a ton of good data for you to analyze. Like it'll find passwords for you and configuration files and code that's put out there, pull out database creds, things like that. And going through that, it'll be a big list. It'll take probably, for a large organization, 3 days to run. You can also point it specifically at a server or a share if you just want to look at one. By default, it's going to try to do the whole domain. So, that will speed it up if hey, this is my one share that I wanted to analyze. You could just point it at that with the UNC path. So that's a really good tool that, we use on our pen tests and red teams, mostly more of a pen test tool. It is pretty noisy, but you can use it too. There's, it's just something you kick off. It doesn't require a ton of time. You let it run and then you can analyze the data afterward and find it's not riddled with false positives. It gives you a ton of good actionable data. Web application flaws. I bring this up because, especially on healthcare networks, everything tends to have a web app. A lot of this specific health technology somehow has a web app on the internal network. You may not realize it does, but it does. And it contributes to a lot of risk we find we go into networks. And a lot of this risk starts from the customer or organization not having understanding of what web applications they have in their network. What I suggest is sort of a twofold approach here. You can take the data from your network-based vulnerability scanner or Nmap and essentially take that and bring it over to a free tool called Go Witness. This is a very powerful tool. What it does is, say you have like 1,000 URLs after you've done your extract, port 80, 443, 8443, 8080, all your web ports, and you see, I got about 1,000 URLs here on my internal network. You can feed it to Go Witness, and it will create an HTML report for you that might be like a few pages long, and it just puts a screenshot of the landing page. So what this gives you is a really good bird's eye view, situational awareness of all your applications in your environment. And then you can kind of see what is that over there? That appliance. Let me go over to that and see this. Can we turn this off? Does this need to be here? You can start having those questions. And that can reduce a lot of risk right there, even without having to do a lot of the fancy higher skill requirement web hacking. To help you with the web hacking part, you can make use of a pretty inexpensive tool called Burp Suite Professional if you haven't started to use that. Admittedly, it does take more skill to run. It is not as much of just a point and click scanning tool. It does have that capability, but a lot of the strength there is going to be having somebody that understands how to do web application flaws and finding them. Definitely worth developing in-house or having some outsourced resource that can help you with that and some periodicity throughout your lifespan here. But that is what I suggest. At least you can do this. You can go back and run Go Witness and give you a ton of good visibility into your internal applications and help you make that risk-based decision. What I find is there are a lot of stuff in the healthcare technology that has apps that don't need to be turned on. So you can probably just turn off the web server feature and just eliminate the risk or reduce the risk significantly there. Now this is very near and dear to my heart. Probably the most fun I have is looking at Active Directory data, which definitely says a lot about me. But I really, really love doing this because it's a feature-rich environment for risk. I love finding risk. I love Active Directory because it's got a lot of opportunity to find risk. It obviously is a pretty big part of every network, generally, right? There are some other alternatives, but for the most part, people are using Active Directory. And over the years, with all the changes that take place to users, computers, and groups, and just in general, it tends to become a rat's nest of permissions. And it can be very difficult to find out, where are the big flaws. And I'll tell you, Active Directory, if you've not have done a deep dive in your Active Directory, you'd be shocked at the amount of risk you could pull out of it. I'll give you another example. So recently, and this happens, more times than you'd be surprised. It happens a lot. The Everyone group, which again is a group that everyone's in, had access to essentially numerous service accounts. They could generic all to them. So they have all permission, full control over these service accounts. You can change the password to them. You can do whatever you want. You, as the attacker, any valid account, pop you right over the service account. From there, those service accounts have access to certificate templates, can legitimately just add users to the domain admin group. You basically have full paths to take over the entire network from anyone. It essentially breaks all the permission hierarchy. And I think the reason this happens, and this happens with a ton of different AD objects, right? We've got some blog posts out there, and I have written a tool too called AD-Recon that helps you automate this and dig into it. But this is a complex topic, suffice to say. But I think the reason the Everyone group is a common area to look at is because when you're assigning, if you ever assign permissions in AD and you're in that properties dialog box and you're typing a name in there, right, and auto completes, and then you assign permission to that object saying, okay, this person has full control over this object. As you're troubleshooting that as the admin, you're like, man, I just added him. It's not working. Let me just add the Everyone, right? Okay, that worked. right? Because it gives everyone permission. So whatever the permission flaw was, it's no longer a flaw anymore, but it's a pretty dirty way to do that, right? It's kind of like if you're a Linux guy, it's the chmod 777, for a file. It makes it full wide and open if you're having a permission issue. So I think that's why I see that a lot is like admins are troubleshooting permission issues. They add the everyone group as a diagnostical test to see, is this a permission issue or is it something else? I'm going to add the everyone group and that's just going to give everyone permission. And if it works, great. And what I'll know it's a permission issue and I can further dive into that. Well, it starts to work and they get pulled in another direction. Another fire pops up. They're busy, right? And then this fire is no longer yelling at them anymore. So they leave it and it remains dormant. Another issue I see all the time, and this is usually shocking to people, when you disable an account in Active Directory, it's most people's impression that that removes the risk. It usually does not remove the risk. Most cases, it does not. So what I do as an attacker is I come in, I look at all the disabled accounts. I look at what can they do outbound. I take a look at everything they can touch. And I actually will count that based on account. So I'll grab the highest ones that can do the most. This person can do 90,000 things. This person can do 60,000 things. I grab these higher ones and I say, well, who can reach them? And you'd be surprised to find out that, hey, somebody low level over here, maybe even the everyone group, right, has generic all to that account. Okay, well, it's disabled, right? We can't use it. Wrong. Because you have generic all, you can just enable it. And that just breaks a lot of people's thought processes on how to fix things in AD. I disabled the account. Okay, I don't care. I enabled the account, right? So that tends to be kind of a shocking moment in a lot of engagements when they're like, how did you, this is account's disabled, we removed the risk. No, it doesn't remove the risk. More times than not, it doesn't remove the risk. So it's something to understand. It's a complex thing, but it is where most of your risk is in your network. If you're using AD, is right here, living in AD. And the way to do this is there's a lot of tools out there that do AD analysis. My favorite is Bloodhound. There are paid versions and there's free versions. We use a free version. There's a lot of ways to do that. It does require, some analysis techniques and some knowledge of how to do it. It's not like a point and click, thing, but it is very powerful. And it's well worth diving into if you're on the security team for your organization. Relay attacks. So this is one of the ones, probably the outlier here, where some of the findings do show up in a vuln scanner, but they're not casted properly for the risk. So you probably have seen SMB signing, like lack of SMB signing. And if you were like me when I was an admin, I was like, boring, okay, what this I'm talking a long time ago. I find most admins, don't truly understand the risk with lack of SMB signing. What you can do there is essentially intercept requests on the network and push it through that SMB service and let it come out that end and essentially run commands or run code. And it can be pretty devastating. There's also other protocols, not just SMB signing. There's link local, multicast, name resolution, which is a mouthful. And that can also be poisoned and relayed. I will conduct these attacks if I really, really need to. I'll report the risk. They are a little more cumbersome to conduct, but it's still possible. What I would suggest is to making sure that SMB signing is disabled on systems and to check for other protocols using a tool called Responder. It's a free tool. You can run it in analyze mode with -A, and it will basically just print out the things that are vulnerable without trying to poison them, which is helpful because the first stage in the relay attack is usually poisoning the protocol and then catching it and relaying it to a vulnerable service. But the responder and analyze mode is great for security teams because you can kind of get a in a harmless way, get a look at what's on the network and start to clean some of these protocols up that could be poisoned in combination with getting SMB signing disabled on hosts. And when you look at SMB signing, that's like a medium in your vuln scanner. I see it more as like a higher critical risk. So it's just something to keep in mind. And like for me as the attacker, that gets me excited and I don't just ignore it. Default credentials and configurations. Again, this is another one of those things that I've never been on a network in my time of doing this where I haven't run into this. And I know it's an easy thing, right? Like, hey, change the passwords and change the configurations. Like we know we're supposed to do this, but it doesn't happen, or there's remnants from the past. Even if you're doing it right now, 10 years ago you weren't, and that stuff's still on the network. So what I suggest doing is kind of going back, is auditing these devices to make sure that you've checked the default credentials. When I go through the Go Witness data like we talked about before, one of the things I'm going to go do is check every single one of them for default creds during an engagement. And again, I usually walk out with 50 plus logins to stuff, right? Default. And this is still today, like if I'm on a large network, I'm going to expect that I'm going to probably have between 25 and 50 boxes I'm going to get into with default creds. I had a situation recently where a device was set up with not a default password, but a default configuration that when you went to go log in, you could do a drop down right there, and it gave you a list of all the users. It was an Active Directory. It was LDAP connected. And it was a critical infrastructure part of the network. I wasn't in that segment yet, so I didn't have those users. It gave me the list of users from that device because it was set up in default configuration. And from there, we jumped back to that first thing I talked about with the weak password reuse, AD slow brute forcing. I now have my users, and I'm going to try those high confidence passwords within the lockout period. And I got into accounts. I actually got into domain admin accounts that method, all starting from a default configuration on an IoT device. So it's important to audit these. There's a tool called Default HTTP Hunter, which is like a script you can run. It's a bash script you can run, which does a pretty good job at getting a lot of default creds. I'll run that, and I will also do Go Witness and just check all the stuff out of Nmap manually. And I'll pull it up and say, what is this device? Try to log into it, Googling, device name, default creds, admin blank, admin password, that kind of thing. Printers are often a huge issue here too, and they're discounted. I've gotten domain admin out of a printer because it was connecting to LDAP with a set of credentials. So I logged in as the default credentials, admin, went to the settings, saw the LDAP connection. The password was starred out, right click, view source. The password wasn't starred out in the source code, and I've got domain admin. So, sometimes some of these things lead to huge risk when they're otherwise kind of dismissed. It's just a printer, whatever, right? Well, it all has risk, and a lot of times it's misunderstood risk that leads to, the problem. This one here, lack of detections. A lot of people put faith in sort of an out-of-the-box solution for monitoring. I also find there's just not a lot of network monitoring at all. If there is network monitoring, it's solely focused on catching malware, beaconing out, and not so much on actual tradecraft happening on your network on the inside. For example, if I do a DC sync on your network, you should have an alert that fires, hey, somebody attempted a DC sync or did a DC sync that wasn't a domain controller. You should have some things like that. Or if I Kerberos all your users, with SPN records and grab those tickets, you should have an alert for that, right? So there's a lot of things that I find that are, common tradecraft that, aren't being caught. And we usually go through that at the end saying, hey, we did these things these times. Here's the timestamps and what we did. What did you catch? And usually it's nothing. So that's a problem, right? Like they have made a lot of investments. As long as you can get around the EDR that's on there, that's usually the one thing that gives you a headache. But outside of that, if you can avoid the EDR endpoint protection, there's usually, it's pretty, in my experience, wide open on the network side of things. So I like to call that out and make sure people understand and test their network monitoring capability to see like, hey, if somebody runs SharpHound on my network, will I detect that? Because you should. Right? There's a lot of things that attackers are going to do that you should have detections for. And then a lot of times, like I said, this is not seen as risk when it's one of the higher risk items in my eyes. It's not something that shows up in a vulnerability scan report, but it is one of the higher risk items in my eyes. And this is the last thing here. So thank you guys for hanging in with me for these 10. Weak password reset procedures. Everybody here has had to reset their password. I'm sure once it happens, it's a business need, right? You have to have it. Ask yourself this question. When you reset your password, what do you need to know, right? Well, you call the help desk. What do they ask? It's been my experience that if I call the help desk and I just have some confidence and charisma and I know the person's name, that's all I need to know. Obviously, if I call shaking and nervous, it's going to be some red flags. But I've actually called the help desk before, and they've said things like, oh, I'm going to set your default password to such and such plus the last 4 of your employee ID. I don't know it. Can you give me that? I just forgot it, man. And they've given it to me. I've even had this happen. I've called the help desk and they said it's the part of the password is going to be the last 4 of your social. Man, shoot. I'm away from I'm away. I don't remember my social. Believe it or not, that worked. I'm like, that shouldn't work, right? You're like, what? You have to remember, your help desk is doing this so much. And I've worked help desk. And if you work help desk for healthcare system, the password resets, you're juggling 5 other things with it. You're busy. You're trying to get and you've done it 1,000 times. It becomes so robotic. You're going through the motions. And if you don't have a strong set of password reset procedures and you don't have regular testing, again, the users are going to be your flaw here. And it's all too easy to social engineer them. We saw the MGM hack, I think it was a couple of years ago now, that was just the password reset process that was exploited, costing huge amounts of money and risk. And again, this is one of the common ways I get into most every network is just by calling the help desk. It usually gets me an initial account calling the help desk and be like, I forgot my password and I'm such and such. And I've done some OSINT on the person, right? So I usually will know, I'll try to know their birthday, their name. I'll try to know these things before I call them, but they seldom ask. They usually just say, like, what's your name? Oh, okay. I'll even call and use a female's name. Like that, you don't have to be good. Like hopefully I don't sound like, I don't think I sound like a female, but it doesn't matter. The point is they're so robotic with it. They're so monotonous with it. They just reset your password and they're never getting tested. They don't fear. They don't have the fear. They don't have the same security mindset. Like this could be somebody trying to take advantage of me here. So it's just important to understand what your password procedures are and to test them regularly. And that's it. I know one of the things I'll say is that we're going to be releasing blog posts on each one of these individual ways, sort of broken out more. But as a takeaway, the tools to recap I saw were Bloodhound and Sharphound. Dig into your AD. You're going to find some cool stuff, I promise. Responder, it's that, those relay attack stuff, run it with analyze mode. You're not doing any poisoning. It's harmless. You have your Snaffler. I promise you, if you do nothing else after this talk, but go and run Snaffler, you're going to be happy. You're going to love it because you're going to pull out tons of cool data from the network and you're going to find PHI. I promise you'll find PHI. You're going to find passwords and you're going to be the man. It's going to feel awesome. Also certify and certify. 90% chance you're going to find a way to get domain admin just running those tools. That takes 1 minute. And then one that will take a little more analysis techniques like Bloodhound is the Burp Suite Professional. So that's kind of, and that's the one paid tool, $400, I think it is. Everything else was free. So,
well, thanks, Andrew. So we do have a few questions here. The first one, can you speak to the risks associated with disabled accounts again?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. There's a blog post we have on this. So a lot of attack paths and Active Directory involve, you're at one point, let's say I'm Bob in accounting. Bob in accounting has access to, for whatever reason, a subset of users. Say they're all disabled, right? But he has a permission of like generic all to them, which is very common, right? You have a setup, your starting point, you have generic all to like several different accounts for some reason. Now, if those accounts are disabled, you might think, all right, well, they're disabled, you can't use them. If you have permission to enable the account, all you're doing by disabling it is adding one extra step for the attacker to enable the account. And so when me as the attacker, I see disabled account, honestly, I'm more interested in them. I see more risk there because I assume you're not you probably aren't protecting it properly because you think you've disabled it. So you think the risk is gone. So it becomes, in the tool I have, AD-Recon, I actually have a script that prints out in there. One of the modules will print out all the disabled users and what each user can do. And then I investigate who can reach those users. So I'm going to look at every disabled user in your environment. And in the blog post shows you how to do that. But that's the high premise of it all, is that disabled accounts really just add one extra step to the attacker of enabling the account to then use those permissions in the attack path. And a lot of people think once they disable it, like, that's it, you can't use it. But again, it's that permission, the attacker might have access over an account that can just re-enable the account. And that's really common because a lot of times the permissions are just generic all over an object.
And then we have, is it possible to say again, what was the tool for PII data that we can find internally?
Oh, yeah. You definitely want to get this one. So that is going to be the Snaffler. It's a free open source tool. You do have to, when you download it, you do have to compile it in Visual Studio. But that's about it. They give you the source code. We've audited the source code. It's legit. It's good. You can change the regular expression, what it's looking for. It's a little more complicated. I had a couple scenarios where if I find a unique password for the organization, like say the organization's name and some weird characters, or a sports team and some weird characters, I'll add that string into what Snaffler's looking for, and it can find more instances of that. But by default, just run Snaffler. You can either run it right at the command line on Windows, just type the executable name, hit enter, and it will take about, for a large network or a medium-sized network, a couple days to run, but it produces an output file that is just filled with tremendous amount of risk. If you've never run it in your environment, you guys are going to be really shocked, and you're going to find a ton of good risk there. So let that run. And I've never not seen it successful in my years of using it. I think you'll have the same results when you use it. You can also point it at an individual share. So if you don't want it to run across the board, you can just let it run on an individual share. One thing about Snaffler is when you do run it, it's just important to know, if your file servers have a vulnerability scanner on them, like McAfee or something like that, or Norton, or sometimes the vulnerability scanners don't have, or the servers don't have for the file servers don't have like full blown EDR. They have some sort of like vuln scanning engine on it. They have oftentimes what are called ECAR files, which are like antivirus test files. And when Snaffler checks that file, it will throw an AV alert. So Snaffler might be giving you AV alerts. You can ignore them. That's just the one thing to keep in mind as you run it in your organization. You might be throwing off some AV alerts on the file server, which is why we don't run it on our red teams. We run it on our pen tests. So, red team is more about not getting caught.
Okay, and then we have on your slide 8, default credentials and configurations. There was a tool mentioned default HTM or something similar. What was the specific tool reference?
Yeah, default HTTP Hunter. This is another good one for doing like default creds, checking for default creds across the network. So default HTTP Login Hunter. And that's just a shell script, like bash script that you run, and you give it a list of targets, like URL targets, and it will go out and get you a bunch of default creds. I'll run that as well as looking at Go Witness and manually checking and Googling. But that's a quick, fast way. You're going to get some wins with that too. If you've never done default credential auditing, you'll get wins with that out the gates. But I would augment it with looking at Go Witness as well and manually checking through the Go Witness data. You'll get situational awareness too of what you got on the inside, which will be very good. Because you might find some web applications that you can just turn off.
Right. And then what is the most common way hospital security needs improvement when conducting engagement? And what contributes the most risk to hospital networks?
Yeah, the most risk is going to be Active Directory. And that's probably true for most networks, but it's no different. It's no different than healthcare networks. And the reason being is obviously Active Directory controls access to so much in the network. And it's just riddled with issues if you've not audited it before in depth. So an attacker can come in there and elevate their access in Active Directory. And what that gets them to is ultimately everything, right? Because if I get domain admin, you might be thinking, well, you're not in the Linux box, you're not in the infrastructure. I just go log into the guy's box who does manage the Linux stuff and I keylog him. And, or, you know what I mean? So like I grab his credentials or steal the SSH keys off his box, right? So it gets you access to everything. It might require a couple hops to get there, but you ultimately get access to everything, which is why, and in my experience, because it is complicated to find those flaws, like a lot of people here I probably changed your opinion on disabled accounts here today. And you might still be like, I'm kind of confused about that. I get it. It is a little bit of a mind shift, but that's how attackers see it. And, you can read the blog post to go a little more. You can obviously, if you have questions after this, you have my contact information. I'll certainly, I'll tell you this. The BPL, it stands for Build, Protect, Learn. The last part, learn, I like to help people learn. I legitimately enjoy it. So you're welcome to reach out. I will spend probably far too long teaching stuff. But in any event, the answer is Active Directory by a high margin. Other ones don't come close in terms of risk level.
Okay. And then we have someone who wants to know, if someone's interested in being a pen tester, what course or cert would you recommend?
Yeah. So the way I did it, I was sitting there doing malware analysis and incident response, like I had mentioned, and I wanted to transition into pen testing. And I did that through a course called OSCP. It's through offensive security. And they actually have started out, they have some beginner courses now, but when I took it way back when, it was just OSCP. And they had an expert level. So I took those courses and completed those certifications, and they have about a 10% pass rate. So they are challenging. It took me about 40 hours a week for 6 months outside of work to study and prep and get my skills up. And that's probably a good average speed people take. I did take my time and learned it. I passed the first go. I didn't want to fail it, but that would be my suggestion. The actual course involves you hands-on hacking 5 systems and writing a report, and you have limited use of tools, so you can't just throw an exploit at it. You actually have to manually hack it. So, and when I hire for pen testers for my company, I'll hire OSCPs, and I'll hire an OSCP with no experience over somebody with experience more times than not. And it's, I should say, I've had the same people since we started, right? So I would suggest OSCP, and they have a beginner course as well. If you're starting out a little new, like if you're new to Linux, they've got a beginner Linux course. So those are 2 really good ways to get started.
Okay. And then, so we have a question about, do you have any specific stuff to water supply and data sharing? Any special considerations there similar to electric power?
Yeah. So I actually do a lot of critical infrastructure. And I will say most of what happens is I will gain access initially through Active Directory, and then the water stuff tends to be a lot of specialized technology with weak issues. So the challenge is not in the SCADA and IC technology. That's like almost like it feels like I'm 90s. It's just getting there. And a lot of times getting that network segment is the big part of the problem that I solve through Active Directory. And then from there, the big challenge on the water networks is that you can't use the same methodology and approach that you use on your enterprise network. So you can't start scanning stuff with Nmap or Nessus because you will break things that have mission critical impact. So what we'll do at that point is use passive techniques to just dump on traffic. And I actually lean really hard on my incident response skills back in the day because I used to just dig through PCAP all day. So that's where I start a lot of my analysis when I'm hacking the critical infrastructure, stuff is I'll look through PCAP passively. I'll sometimes get a tap that I'll have them get a tap on the network, give me a dump of PCAP for a day, and I dig through that to find protocols and I get a lay of the land. And from there, I'm not getting the initial data from like the scanning tools. I have that data already built out from the passive data collection with the PCAP, and then I'm interacting with it very surgically. Versus when you're on an enterprise network, you can kind of like, run a scan, you can run Nmap, you can't do that kind of stuff on a critical infrastructure network. It is easier in the regard of this, the vulnerabilities are trivial, and a lot of times it's just getting access to an HMI, which is on a Windows domain, right? So you're going back to that Active Directory, still in play. And then it's just a matter of when you're dealing with the technology itself, in terms of finding the data you need, you usually want to rely on passive data collection and PCAP analysis versus, a lot of vuln scanning tools, because you don't want to be the one that took something down that's preventing water or power somewhere. And also I'd say physical security, right? We haven't really talked about that, but that's a huge issue with the water supply stuff and critical infrastructure. Is a lot of times once you get in the door there, you're just plugging in and you circumvented a ton of controls. Maybe you sidestepped even having to go to Active Directory itself. So we didn't really talk about physical security in this talk, but suffice to say that is a huge risk that isn't covered here because the context of the talk was around vulnerability scanners. That's another area that's a bigger focus in the water supply side of things.
How often are you seeing medical devices as valuable target to either gain initial access, elevated access, or assist in avoiding detection while navigating through the network?
It would be pretty often they can lead to getting access to the network. It depends if they're, in terms of Active Directory, it depends on if it's an AD connected device or not. A lot of the medical devices I found, it's almost like I feel like it's 50-50 if it's AD connected or not. Some of them tie into LDAP, some of them don't. If they tie into LDAP, they generally can be a feature rich to get you initial access like I described. I think one of my examples, I mentioned how the medical device gave me all the users in the network, and it allowed me to pivot and do the AD soft brute forcing, which you don't want to do that unless you have a valid set of users. Like you don't want to guess the user and the password. You're not going to be successful. It's just not, you want to enumerate the users first. There's a lot of ways to do it. So that's where I would say you get a lot of help from those non-standard IT devices that are AD connected. If they're not AD connected, the risk tends to be focused around the PHI or the actual impacting the mission that they're supporting.
Great. Once again, I'd like to thank our speakers for their insight and our listeners for taking the time to attend the webinar.